The war began not on the ground, but in the air. Long before the tanks rolled and the soldiers crossed the borders, the sky had already chosen sides. It would no longer be a space of wonder, but of terror, a stage where man's most beautiful dream, the dream of flight, became the most efficient instrument of death. In the dawn of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the heavens above Europe filled with the sound of engines, not the fragile hum of early aviation, but the deep, mechanical growl of machines built to kill. The sky, once a place of imagination and freedom, turned gray with exhaust, smoke, and fear. And as people looked up, they saw not clouds, but vultures of steel. The Second World War was the first conflict where the air itself became the battlefield. The Great War had hinted at it, with its slow biplanes and canvas wings. But this was different. The aircraft of 1939 were faster, deadlier, and far more ruthless. They were not merely scouts or artillery spotters. They were executioners. Nations now fought not only for land and oil, but for the sky, the true throne of power. In factories from Berlin to Bristol, from Tokyo to Detroit, engines were forged like hearts for monsters. Every nation had its own vision of what domination looked like. For Germany, speed and precision. For Britain, grace and endurance. For America, overwhelming firepower. For Japan, sacrifice and faith. And in that race for the heavens, the boundaries of morality and physics began to dissolve. The world's first victims of aerial terror were not soldiers, but civilians. In Poland, the German Luftwaffe introduced the concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It was not simply a military tactic, it was psychological warfare. When the sirens began to wail, people knew what followed: the scream of the Stuka dive bomber, the whistling of its bombs, the explosion that tore streets apart. Fear became a weapon as potent as any bullet. Within days, cities like WWII and Warsaw became laboratories of destruction. German bombers flew in perfect formation, their shadows passing over churches, markets, and schools. From below, they looked almost peaceful, a flock of black birds drifting in sunlight until the bombs fell, and peace itself ceased to exist. That was the birth of modern air warfare. It was not honor that ruled the sky now, but efficiency. The Heinkel, He-111, and Dornier Do-17, with their sleek frames and glass cockpits, delivered death with surgical precision. The Ju-88, the chameleon of the Luftwaffe, could dive, climb, or vanish into the night. Each had its own rhythm, its own method of killing, and every engine that roared above meant someone below would not live to hear the next dawn. But it was not only Germany that learned to weaponize the sky. Britain and France built their own squadrons. The Soviet Union experimented with brutal simplicity. America watched, waited, and began its quiet preparation for total dominance. By 1940, the world had accepted a new truth. Whoever controlled the air would control the war. The sky became a map of ambition and terror. Every cloud could hide an enemy. Every sound could be the last thing you heard. The rhythm of daily life shifted to the pulse of engines. Farmers in the fields stopped to listen to distant hums. Mothers herded their children underground at the faintest siren, and soldiers learned to read the sky as if it were a second front line. In those early years, air power was still a kind of dark magic. People spoke of planes as if they were alive beasts with moods and tempers. Pilots treated their machines like lovers or demons, whispering to them before takeoff. "Keep me alive today," they'd say, stroking the cold metal skin. For many, the bond between man and machine was all that stood between life and oblivion. But even as the technology advanced, the purpose grew simpler: destruction. Cities were not just targets, they were messages. The bombing of Guernica in 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, had already shown the world what air power could do, how a single squadron could erase a town in hours. Picasso's painting would immortalize that horror, but it was only the beginning. By the time the real war began, Guernica's tragedy had become the blueprint. Every nation studied, improved, and perfected the art of annihilation. The engines became louder, the payloads heavier, the range longer. Aircraft no longer needed to see the whites of their enemies' eyes. They could kill from miles above. The bomber pilot became both executioner and witness, too high to feel guilt, too human to forget what he'd done. And beneath all that noise, A new kind of silence took root. The silence of cities waiting for the next raid. The silence after the sirens stopped, but before the first explosion hit. That silence was the sound of the modern world dying. By 1941, the sky had become an empire of fire. From London to Moscow, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, the war spread not by marching feet but by wings. The horizon itself became weaponized. The sun rose on smoke and set on ashes. Humanity had conquered the heavens, but it had lost its soul in the process. For the first time in history, man could look down upon the world from the sky and see not beauty, but opportunity. From that height, borders disappeared. So did morality. What mattered was the target, the coordinates, the mission. In a world at war, the sky was no longer blue. It was gray with ambition, black with smoke, and red with the reflection of flames below. And soon in that vast and merciless theater, the most terrifying instruments of destruction would reveal themselves machines whose names would echo in fear across generations. And soon, the sky itself would become the battlefield's most terrifying weapon. It began with a scream. Not a human scream, though millions would follow, but the mechanical wail of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the dive bomber whose voice became the soundtrack of terror. Its howl was not an accident of engineering. It was designed, refined, perfected the Jericho trumpet, a siren bolted to its wings to turn descent into nightmare. When the Stuka fell from the clouds, it carried sound before death. Villages, trenches, and columns of soldiers all learned to recognize that pitch, a thin, rising shriek that split the air like a blade. To those below, it felt like the sky itself was screaming. For a few seconds, everything froze. Hearts, lungs, time. Then came the explosion. The Stuka was the purest expression of blitzkrieg, Hitler's new art of war speed, shock, and precision. In the late 1930 seconds, German tacticians understood what no one else dared to imagine. Fear could move faster than any tank. The Ju-87 would make that theory flesh. At first glance, it looked ungainly: bent wings, fixed landing gear, and a siren's mouth. Yet in the hands of its pilots, it became a ritual weapon. They climbed high into the sunlight, marked their targets, then turned the world upside down. The nose tipped earthward, the airframe shuddered, and gravity took over. At 600 kilometers per hour, the pilot felt his blood rush to his skull as the siren began its cry. In Poland, the Stuka baptized modern warfare. When the invasion began on the 1st of September 1939, its first victims were not soldiers but civilians. Over the town of WWII, 36 Stukas dropped 70 tons of bombs, annihilating hospitals and homes before breakfast. Survivors said the bombs did not simply destroy buildings, they tore sound out of the air. The earth trembled, windows burst inward, and the only thing louder than the explosions was silence afterward. In those first weeks, the Stuka was everywhere, hunting bridges, convoys, and pockets of resistance. Its accuracy was terrifying. With a 500-kilogram bomb slung beneath its fuselage, it could strike within meters of a moving tank. When the Polish cavalry charged at the German line, the Ju-87 seconds answered with fire from above, reducing valor to ashes. The message was clear. Resistance was obsolete. When France fell in 1940, the Stuka led the way again. At dawn, they darkened the skies over the Ardennes. French troops heard the sirens before they saw the planes. The scream rose, fell, then vanished into impact. Tanks burst, roads melted, men threw down rifles, and ran not from the bombs themselves, but from what they felt in those seconds before they landed. The Wehrmacht advanced behind that sound like a tide behind thunder. The Stuka was a weapon of terror, as much as of precision. The Luftwaffe understood that panic was contagious. Once soldiers broke, whole armies collapsed. Once cities hid, whole nations surrendered. The Ju-87 did not just destroy targets, it destroyed confidence. But its power came with a price. The Stuka was slow, fragile, and nearly defenseless against modern fighters. Its grace ended when the enemy fought back. During the Battle of Britain, in the summer of 1940, that weakness was exposed. British Spitfires and Hurricanes fell upon the dive bombers like hawks. The scream that had terrified Europe now became a death cry for its own pilots. Over the Channel, dozens of Stukas fell burning into the sea, their black smoke trailing across the gray waves. The once unstoppable symbol of blitzkrieg was forced into retreat. Even so, its legend endured. For years afterward, whenever anti-aircraft crews heard a high-pitched whine in the wind, they would flinch, remembering the sound that had once heralded apocalypse. Inside the cockpit, the experience was beyond human limits. Pilots spoke of the dive as a kind of possession. One recalled, "The world narrowed to the crosshairs. My vision went gray. The siren screamed louder than my heart. When I pulled up, I wasn't sure if I was still alive." The Stuka blurred the line between man and machine. Each dive was a confession of faith in speed, in obedience, in terror itself. It was not built to survive long wars. It was built to win short ones. And for a time, it did. By 1941, as the Luftwaffe turned east toward the Soviet Union, the Ju-87 found a new kind of war. It hunted tanks across the endless plains, carving scars into the steppe. Soviet troops nicknamed it the Black Death. But the Red Air Force grew stronger, and the Stuka's dominance faded once more. By 1943, it was a relic, a ghost of its own legend. Yet its voice lingered, a phantom sound, etched into Europe's memory. The Stuka's terror was not only mechanical, it was philosophical. It taught the world that technology could manipulate emotion, with surgical precision, that sound itself could be a weapon. The siren was no longer warning of danger. It was danger. It proved that the human mind could be conquered long before the body fell. Even decades after the war, recordings of the Jericho trumpet still chilled those who heard them. Museums preserved surviving aircraft like fossils of fear. Children who had once hidden in basements during air raids could not bear to listen. The sound reached across generations, whispering of a time when the sky screamed before it killed. The Stuka marked the birth of the age of total war, where civilians were targets, where terror was strategy, and where the line between victory and atrocity blurred beneath the shadow of wings. And as the echoes of its sirens faded into history, new engines rose to take its place, engines not designed to frighten, but to annihilate. But the skies would soon belong to machines, far deadlier than screams. They came not like thunder, but like a heartbeat, steady, mechanical, merciless. The people of Europe would learn to recognize that rhythm, the deep, pulsing drone of engines in the night. When the ground began to tremble and the windows rattled in their frames, they knew the bombers were coming. The Luftwaffe called them Heinkel, He 111 seconds, Dornier Du 17 seconds, and Junkers Ju 88 seconds. History would remember them by another name, the engines of hell. When the invasion of Poland began, they led the charge. Columns of German tanks cut through fields and forests, but it was the bombers that struck first. They didn't just attack, they dismantled. Railways, bridges, convoys, anything that moved or mattered vanished beneath waves of fire. The sky itself became a factory line of destruction. He 111 seconds flew in tight formations, their bellies opening like jaws to feed the world below to the flames. At Weilen, at Warsaw, and later across Rotterdam, London, and Coventry, the rhythm was always the same: siren, engines, explosion, silence. The Luftwaffe had perfected terror into a formula: the Heinkel. He 111 was the symbol of that machine-made apocalypse. It looked almost graceful, its glass nose reflecting the sun, its body curving like a bird in flight. But its beauty was deceitful. Each one carried more than 2 tons of bombs. Pilots sat behind a dome of crystal, watching cities shrink beneath them as they pressed the release switch. In September 1939, those bombers leveled Warsaw in a storm of smoke and ruin. Within a week, thousands were dead. When the guns paused, the silence felt heavier than the bombardment. Survivors would later say that the sound of an engine overhead could make a child cry for years after the war. Next came the Dornier Du 17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil. It was fast, slender, efficient, a knife in the sky. When Germany invaded the Low Countries in 1940, Du 17 squadrons cut through the air at low altitude, their bombs shattering Dutch and Belgian defenses before the ground forces even arrived. On the 14th of May 1940, the city of Rotterdam burned. In less than 15 minutes, over 1,000 civilians were dead, tens of thousands homeless. The flames climbed hundreds of feet into the air, their glow visible 50 kilometers away. Pilots who looked back saw the reflection of their own work, glimmering on the surface of the river, an infernal mirror of triumph and shame. But it was the Junkers Ju-88 that completed the trio, the chameleon of the Luftwaffe, capable of almost anything. It could dive like a Stuka, bomb like a Heinkel, and even fight as a night hunter. By 1940, Ju-88 seconds became the centerpiece of Hitler's dream of domination, a single aircraft to rule the war. When the Battle of Britain began, the sky over London turned into a furnace. The bombers came every night, their engines humming in synchronized menace. People in the city began to measure time not by hours, but by raids. Every sunset was a countdown to fire. Inside the cockpits, the German crews worked in silence. Navigation lights dimmed. They followed radio beacons into the dark. Through the haze of anti-aircraft flak, they opened their bomb bays. The city glowed below docks, rail yards, homes, cathedrals, all indistinguishable from this height. One steady hand, one click of a switch, and gravity did the rest. Down below, Londoners huddled in basements and subway tunnels. They could hear the whine of bombs cutting through the air, each one like a falling scream. Then, the explosion, the earth jumping beneath their feet, the air turning solid from pressure. When they emerged at dawn, the city they remembered was gone. In Coventry, the bombing reached biblical scale. On the 14th of November 1940, more than 500 bombers unleashed nearly 500 tons of explosives. The medieval cathedral crumbled, its spire collapsing into flames. The city burned for 2 days. Witnesses said the sky turned red, and the heat could be felt miles away. Hitler called it Coventration, a new word for annihilation. The goal was never just military. It was psychological. The bombers were built not only to destroy, but to convince nations that resistance was pointless, to make civilians feel the hopelessness of modern war. The Luftwaffe understood something the world had not yet accepted, that terror, when applied efficiently, could be as strategic as tactics. But even in this new age of destruction, the bombers were not invincible. When the Royal Air Force learned to fight back, the hunters rose to meet the prey. Spitfires and Hurricanes climbed into the night, their machine guns blazing through clouds. For the first time, the engines of hell met their equals. The Luftwaffe began to lose planes faster than it could replace them. The invincible rhythm of conquest began to falter. Yet, even in defeat, the damage was done. The bombers had changed warfare forever. Cities were no longer sanctuaries. The idea of home front had vanished. Every home was a front. To the men who flew them, these aircraft were both tool and torment. Some believed they were fighting for victory. Others knew they were serving destruction itself. A Heinkel pilot captured after the war said quietly, "We believed we were gods, but gods do not cry in their sleep." When the war moved east, the bombers followed. They burned Minsk, Smolensk, Stalingrad, one city after another. But the farther they flew, the weaker they became. Soviet air defenses hardened, and Allied factories began producing faster, stronger machines. The sky that Germany once ruled began to turn against it. Still, the memory of those nights would linger. Even decades later, the survivors of London, Warsaw, and Rotterdam could recall the sound, that low, steady hum that began as a vibration in the chest and ended as fire on the horizon. The bombers had given mankind its first glimpse of total war. They were the instruments of a new era, one that would culminate in horrors beyond even their imagination. Because while the engines of hell still ruled by fear, a new predator was taking shape, one born not for terror, but for pursuit. And while the bombers ruled through fear, the hunters were being born. The bombers had made the world look up in fear. Their engines rolled like thunder, their fire turned night into day. But no empire of the air lasts forever. From the burning cities below, from the wreckage and the smoke, a new kind of machine rose, smaller, faster, and deadlier. They were built not to terrorize the ground, but to hunt the sky itself. The dawn of the fighter had arrived. If the bombers were the engines of hell, then these were the angels of fury. They fought not with distance, but with intimacy. Battles fought at arm's length, within heartbeats. One wrong move meant death. To kill, they had to fly close enough to see the fear in their enemies' eyes. It was over the gray waters of the English Channel that the first great duel of this new age was born, the Battle of Britain, 1940. Germany had conquered most of Europe. The Luftwaffe, confident and experienced, was now preparing to crush the last obstacle between Hitler and domination of the continent, the island fortress of Britain. The plan was simple: bomb the Royal Air Force into extinction, then invade. But Britain had a secret weapon: its hunters. 2 aircraft, 2 legends, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Together, they stood between the German bombers and their prey. The Spitfire was not just an airplane. It was art shaped into vengeance. Sleek, elegant, its wings curved like a blade in flight. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screamed at full throttle, a sound that came to mean salvation to millions below. Pilots loved it as if it were alive. Many gave it a name, touched its fuselage before takeoff, whispering the same plea: "Bring me home." The Messerschmitt Bf 109, its adversary, was the pride of the Luftwaffe, the most advanced fighter in the world when the war began. It could climb faster, dive harder, and hit with a cannon powerful enough to tear bombers apart. In the hands of German aces, it was both scalpel and scythe. Their duels filled the summer sky. Every morning, the radar towers of southern England spotted the incoming raids, hundreds of bombers, escorted by swarms of Bf 109 seconds. Sirens wailed. Pilots scrambled from their bunks, sprinting across airfields to their aircraft, engines roaring before their belts were even fastened. Then came the climb, steep, dizzying, rising into the Sunday. Above 15,000 feet, they met. From the ground, it looked almost graceful, white trails twisting and crossing against the blue. But in the cockpit, there was no grace, only chaos. The air shook with gunfire. Planes flipped, rolled, and dove in a blur of metal and smoke. One burst of bullets could end a life. A heartbeat's hesitation could turn hunter into prey. The Battle of Britain was more than an air campaign. It was survival. Every man in the Royal Air Force knew that if they failed, invasion would follow. If they fell, so would the nation. They flew, fought, and died, in shifts measured not by hours, but by sorties. Some flew 5 times a day. They slept beside their aircraft, exhausted, ready for the next alarm. In London, families listened to the drone of battle overhead, knowing that each explosion could mean victory or loss. The fate of a nation was written not on maps, but in the vapor trails above its skies. By August 1940, the air over southern England had become a living thing, a beast made of engines, bullets, and courage. The Luftwaffe expected quick victory. Instead, they found defiance. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, his words immortalized those men. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few were barely more than boys, some only 19, their faces still soft with youth. But when they took to the air, they became something larger. History would remember them as the few, the guardians of the sky. Their courage turned the tide. The Luftwaffe's bombers began to fall faster than Germany could replace them. Bf 109 seconds, limited by their short fuel range, could not protect their formations once they crossed deep into England. The hunters had found their rhythm. By October, Hitler postponed the invasion. The Blitz would continue, but the dream of conquering the skies had died. Britain still stood scarred, battered, but unbroken. The victory was not just strategic, it was spiritual. The fighter had proven that technology alone did not win wars, will did. The sky could be defended not by machines, but by men willing to risk everything. Yet, even in triumph, a darker truth took shape. Every advance in aviation brought a new kind of death. The fighters that saved Britain were now prototypes for the next generation: faster, heavier, more merciless. Across the world, engineers studied every battle, every weakness, every wreck. In America, the P-51 Mustang was born a long-range fighter that would one day escort bombers deep into Germany. In the Soviet Union, the Yak-3 took shape, agile and relentless. And in the Pacific, Japan unveiled a new predator of its own, the Mitsubishi A-6M0, a machine that could turn like thought and strike like lightning. The hunters had changed everything. They had dethroned the bombers, rewritten the laws of the sky, and shown the world that air supremacy was not a dream, it was destiny. But in doing so, they had set humanity on a new path, one where speed became God, and where man's greatest fear was no longer falling, but flying too high. The skies were evolving again, and somewhere in Germany, behind secret hangars and barbed wire, engineers were already building the future of machines so fast it would make every other plane obsolete. But in the race for the skies, Germany was preparing to unleash a nightmare unlike any before. By 1944, the sky over Europe had become a graveyard. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of nations, was now outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. Allied bombers filled the horizon like migrating storms, raining destruction on German cities. Every day, the hum of thousands of engines echoed across the ruins. The hunters who had once ruled the air were now the hunted. Desperation, however, is the mother of invention. And in the twilight of its empire, Germany sought salvation, not in numbers, but in speed. Deep inside hangars at Augsburg, Leipzig, and Rechlin, engineers worked under the shadow of defeat, drawing blueprints that looked more like science fiction than war. They dreamed of a machine that could climb faster, fly higher, and strike before the enemy even saw it coming, a weapon that could rewrite the laws of flight itself. Its name was whispered, like a secret prayer, Messerschmitt Me 262. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. No propellers, no roar of pistons, only the strange, low howl of jet engines, twin streams of fire stitched to its fuselage. The Me 262 could fly at nearly 900 kilometers per hour, faster than any fighter or bomber of its age. Its silhouette was sleek, elegant, and predatory, a silver arrow born to pierce the sound of war. When it first took flight in 1942, even its test pilots were astonished. One described it as a dream from the future and a nightmare to control. The aircraft was temperamental, dangerous, and revolutionary. But to Hitler's collapsing regime, it was a miracle. He called it, "my Blitz bomber." In his mind, the Me 262 would save Germany, destroying Allied bombers, halting invasions, turning the tide. Yet his obsession with using it as a bomber, rather than a fighter, delayed its deployment by almost a year, a fatal mistake. By the time the Swallow, as its pilots called it, entered service in 1944, Germany was already burning. But when it finally appeared, the effect was electric. Allied pilots who saw it for the first time could barely believe their eyes. They called it the Silver Ghost, a shape that flashed past before their guns could even turn. Dogfights that once lasted minutes ended in seconds. The Me 262 could dive through bomber formations, its 430mm cannons ripping through metal and men alike. Entire squadrons of B-17 seconds were torn from the sky before their gunners could react. The Allies had ruled the air by numbers, but numbers meant nothing against speed. In those moments, the Me 262 was not a weapon, it was prophecy. It whispered of a new world, a future where flight would no longer be bound by propellers and drag, where war itself would move at the speed of sound. Inside the cockpit, however, the miracle was also a curse. The engines, built of materials too fragile for their power, overheated, stalled, or exploded. Fuel was scarce. Replacement parts were dreams. Pilots had to nurse the aircraft like a dying animal, praying it would hold together long enough to return to base. Yet when it worked, it was godlike. The roar of the jet engines had a different quality from any sound before, deeper, smoother, alien. Civilians who heard it during air raids said it felt as though the sky was breathing fire. Allied bomber crews, trapped inside their formations, often saw Me 262 seconds streak past like lightning bolts, leaving only shockwaves and fear in their wake. One American pilot recalled, "You didn't fight the Me 262. You survived it. It came, it struck, and it vanished like a thunderclap in sunlight. But for all its brilliance, it was too late." The jet age had arrived, but not in time to save the Reich. Germany could produce only a few hundred Me 262 seconds. Many were destroyed on the ground before they could ever fly, bombed by Allied raids that turned their airfields into craters. The handful that did take off were hunted relentlessly by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts waiting above their runways. In a bitter irony, the world's first jet fighters were often destroyed before they even left the Earth. And yet, even as Germany collapsed, the legend of the Me 262 grew. It became more than a machine. It became a warning, a glimpse of the wars to come. The Allies, Once they captured surviving aircraft, studied them obsessively. Engineers in Britain, America, and the Soviet Union took notes, sketched copies, and quietly began building the next generation. Within a few years, every major power would have jet fighters of its own. The Mi-262 was a ghost from the future, haunting the present. Its pilots, young, proud, doomed, flew, knowing their victories meant nothing. The war was lost. But they flew anyway, for honor, for revenge, for the pure, impossible beauty of flight. One of them, Adolf Galland, later said, "When I flew the Mi-262, I felt as though I had stepped out of the war and into tomorrow. Tomorrow was already here, and it was terrifying." The Mi-262 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was not a savior, it was a sign. Its contrails were the fingerprints of modern warfare, stretching across the sky like scars. In the closing days of the war, as Allied troops marched through shattered cities and Soviet tanks rolled toward Berlin, the last of the Mi-262 seconds took flight. They were hunted, cornered, destroyed, but their speed left an impression that time could not erase. The jet had changed everything, and in its shadow, the next generation of warplanes was already forming faster, higher, and soon, unstoppable. But not all terrors came from the enemy. Some were born from the sky itself. In the final years of the Pacific War, a new sound haunted the sailors of the Allied fleet. It was not the rumble of engines or the whistle of bombs, but something quieter, stranger, the rising whine of a single engine cutting through the clouds, followed by the roar of impact and fire. They had a name for it: Kamikaze, the divine wind. The men who flew them did not return. It began in October 1944, when the Empire of Japan faced the inevitable. Its navy was shattered, its air force decimated, its homeland within reach of invasion. Defeat was certain. Yet to the Japanese high command, surrender was not a word, and failure was worse than death. So they turned to something older, deeper, the ancient code of Bushido, the belief that dying for one's emperor was the highest form of honor. From that belief came the special attack units, young men trained not to survive, but to die. They were barely out of school, some as young as 17. They wrote farewell letters to mothers, painted flags with prayers, and took their seats in aircraft modified to carry more explosives than fuel. Their mission was simple and absolute: find the enemy and become the weapon. The first kamikaze struck during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. A single plane plunged into the carrier USS Street Low, igniting the fuel stores below deck. Within minutes, the ship was engulfed in flame. It sank, taking 143 men with it. To the Japanese command, this was proof that even in defeat, sacrifice could still yield victory. To the men on the ships below, it was something else entirely, a new kind of terror. Because this was not just war. It was suicide made strategic. The kamikaze were unlike anything the world had seen. The logic of combat attack, retreat, survive, no longer applied. They did not care about odds, or numbers, or escape routes. They aimed for the biggest ship, the brightest deck, the most crowded spot. When their planes emerged from the clouds, there was no pattern to predict, no reason to bargain with. They were men who had already died, still flying. American sailors would later describe the experience with awe and dread. One witness aboard the USS Bunker Hill recalled, "They came out of the sun, diving almost vertically. You could see the pilot's head calm, focused. He never wavered. We fired everything we had, but they didn't flinch. They didn't dodge. They just came straight for us." On the 11th of May, 1945, Bunker Hill was struck by two kamikazes within 30 seconds. The explosions tore through the decks, killing nearly 400 men. The ship burned for 2 days. Survivors spoke of the heat, the screams, the endless sound of ammunition cooking off in the fire. "It was hell," one said, "and the devil had wings." The kamikaze turned the sky into a moral abyss. They were not machines of steel and fuel alone. They were flesh, faith, and desperation fused together. In each one sat a boy raised to believe his death could redeem his nation. Many were not fanatics, but frightened patriots, pressured by commanders and shamed by propaganda. Before takeoff, they were given a ceremonial drink sack, or water, and tied white headbands with the rising Sunday. They smiled for the camera, saluted, and climbed into their planes. Then they disappeared into the clouds. The Japanese called them Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Units, invoking the legend of the typhoon that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. They believed the Divine Wind had returned, but this time it was not nature that would save them. It was their own youth, burned as offerings to a dying empire. To the Allied forces, the Kamikaze were the embodiment of madness, unpredictable, unstoppable, inhuman. Yet to those who flew them, the act was deeply human. They left diaries, poems, and sketches. Many wrote about fear, about loneliness, about wishing they had more time. One pilot wrote the night before his mission, "Tomorrow I will fly toward eternity. I am not afraid, but I am not proud either. I only hope that my mother will forgive me." Another, just 19 years old, left behind a haiku, "Falling cherry blossoms. Each petal, a soldier's heart. The wind knows their names." The Kamikaze campaign intensified in 1945 as the Allies advanced toward Okinawa. Over 3,000 planes hurled themselves at the American fleet. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed. Ships burned for days, smoke rising from the ocean like incense for the dead. The sheer scale of it stunned even hardened veterans. Every pilot who took off was a ghost before reaching the clouds. Every attack an act of both courage and futility. But the divine wind could not stop the storm. Japan's sacrifice became its tragedy. The kamikaze raids delayed the inevitable but did not alter it. The empire's resources were gone, its cities in ruins, its people starving. The waves of death from the sky achieved what no weapon ever could. They broke the world's heart. When Japan finally surrendered, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the surviving kamikaze pilots wept, not because they lived, but because they hadn't died. One survivor said years later, "We were taught that the greatest shame was to return alive. But when I saw the ashes of my country, I realized that dying would have meant nothing." The kamikaze were both heroes and victims, symbols of devotion, twisted by desperation. They showed that even the most sacred ideals could be weaponized, that the line between bravery and madness was only as wide as the span of a wing. Their legacy lingers not in glory, but in warning. For they proved that the most terrifying weapon is not the machine, but the mind willing to die for it. The sky had seen men become bombs, faith become fire, and honor become ash. And as the flames faded over the Pacific, another kind of inferno was rising, one that would not need pilots, or courage, or sacrifice, only silence. And as men died in flames, new monsters of metal took their place. By 1944, the sky itself had become a factory of death. The age of the single pilot, the intimate dogfight, was ending. In its place rose something colder, larger, and infinitely more terrifying: the heavy bomber, a weapon not of precision but of scale. The world had learned that the surest way to break a nation was not to defeat its army, but to burn its cities. And in that philosophy of annihilation, the Allies found their greatest monsters. They were called the Flying Fortresses, the Boeing B-17, the Avro Lancaster, the consolidated B-24, and finally, the B-29 Superfortress. These were not planes. They were airborne fortifications of steel and fire. Each carried a crew of 10 and a belly full of bombs, 2, 5, sometimes 10 tons of destruction. They could fly for hours at altitudes so high that frost formed on the gun barrels, while below them entire cities slept in ignorance of what was coming. The B-17, the first of the giants, was the workhorse of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Its 4 engines hummed like a choir of engines from hell, its body armored with machine guns that pointed in every direction: nose, tail, belly, sides. It earned its name honestly: Flying Fortress. Crews decorated their planes with pin-up art, names like Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, and 909, as if giving death a smile could make it less monstrous. From 1,942 onward, B-17 formations darkened the European sky. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, flew together in vast geometric formations, an armada of wings, stretching from horizon to horizon. Below them lay Germany, industrial cities, weapon factories, and, inevitably, the homes of those who built them. The bombers came by day, the Lancasters by night. The distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved under falling fire. The British Avro Lancaster was the RAF's answer to the fortress. Larger, heavier, and capable of carrying the war's most massive bombs. It was the backbone of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command. Each night, as the clock struck 10, engines rumbled across airfields in England. The ground crews waved goodbye, knowing that many of those planes would never return. Once airborne, they climbed into darkness, navigating by stars, radar, and faith. At 20,000 feet, they opened their bomb bays over cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. When the bombs fell, the world below became a furnace. The firestorm over Hamburg in 1943 reached temperatures hotter than molten steel. Asphalt streets melted, oxygen was sucked from the air, suffocating those who sought shelter underground. Entire districts burned in a single night. The flames rose so high that pilots reported turbulence from the heat and updraft of hell itself. In Dresden, February 1945, the inferno reached its peak. Lancasters dropped high-explosive bombs to shatter rooftops, then incendiaries to feed the blaze. Within hours, the medieval city became a vortex of fire. Tens of thousands of civilians, refugees, children, the elderly, were consumed where they stood. The heat fused brick and bone into glass. It was not war, it was erasure. The men in the bombers never saw the faces of those below. Through their plexiglass domes, the world looked distant, unreal, a glowing map. They measured success by tonnage dropped, by factory destroyed, by coordinates hit. When the doors closed and the bombs fell, there was no sound but the wind. Then, moments later, a pulse of light from the horizon, followed by the faint concussion that shook their boots. The crews lived in a strange purgatory, half machine, half man. They slept between missions, knowing each flight could be their last. A single flak burst could tear a wing apart. A single German Messerschmitt could send 10 men to their deaths. The survival rate for bomber crews was lower than for infantry in the trenches of the First World War. Yet they flew again, and again, and again, because they believed, or were told to believe, that each mission brought the war closer to its end. Their courage was undeniable, their purpose less so. In the Pacific, the bomber grew even larger, even colder. The B-29 Superfortress represented the pinnacle of mankind's ability to wage war from the stratosphere. It could fly higher and farther than anything before it, carrying the weight of entire wars in its bays. With its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and sheer size, it seemed less like an airplane and more like a prophecy, a vision of war without limits. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 turned that prophecy into fact. In a single night, 334 B-29 seconds dropped nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs. The city, built largely of wood and paper, ignited like kindling. The fires merged into a single storm that devoured everything in its path. Over 100,000 people died more than at Hiroshima, their screams drowned by the roar of the flames and the hum of engines above. One American pilot later wrote, "I looked down and saw a sea of fire. It was as if the world itself were burning, and I wondered what we had become." That question echoed through every crew that returned home. They had survived, yes, but what had they built in surviving? The heavy bomber was the perfect paradox of progress. It embodied courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Yet it also represented mankind's descent into industrialized destruction. In its shadow, morality became arithmetic. The measure of success was not victory, but obliteration. From the Blitz to Dresden, from Hamburg to Tokyo, the monsters of the air had fulfilled their purpose. They had proven that the sky could erase the earth. But even that was not enough. For in the summer of 1945, one final aircraft prepared to take flight, not to burn cities, but to end a world. It carried a weapon so powerful that even the firestorms of Europe would seem like sparks beside it. And when even the giants of war burned, one weapon remained born not of fire, but of silence. At 8:15 a.m., on the 6th of August 1945, the sky above Hiroshima was a perfect blue. The cicadas sang, the river glimmered, and children walked to school beneath the rising Sunday. No one looked up when they heard the hum of an airplane by then. It was the sound of everyday life. The aircraft was high, alone, unthreatening. It carried no swarm, No escort, no warning sirens. Just one name, painted in soft cursive on its nose: Enola Gay. Inside, a crew of 12 men sat in silence. The pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had memorized every line of the mission brief. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, weighed over 9,000 pounds and contained a secret that even the men dropping it did not fully understand. Below them lay a city of 350,000 souls. The sky was calm. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the bomb bay doors opened. The object fell slowly, almost gracefully, spinning through the sunlight. It took 43 seconds to reach the ground. Then the world ended. A flash brighter than the Sunday. A silence sharper than sound. And then whined. The shock wave rolled through Hiroshima like the breath of a god. Concrete turned to dust. Steel bent like wax. Human shadows were burned into walls. The city vanished in an instant, 70,000 lives erased before they could scream. The survivors wandered through a landscape that no longer resembled the earth. Skin hung from their arms in tatters. The river boiled. The sky glowed a color no one had ever seen before: white, then violet, then black. In the cockpit of the Enola Gay, one of the crew gasped, "My God, what have we done?" No one answered. The radio was silent. The only sound was the endless roar of the wind, circling the ruins below. 3 days later, on August 9th, the ritual repeated over Nagasaki. Another plane, another bomb, Fat Man. The target missed its mark slightly, but the effect was the same. The explosion flattened the valley, burned the river, and took 40,000 lives in seconds. The mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet into the air, a pillar of smoke visible for miles, marking the beginning of a new age, the atomic age. It was no longer fire that ruled the sky, but silence. The B-29 superfortress that carried those weapons was not a monster like the bombers of Europe. It was quiet, graceful, clinical, a surgeon's hand where once there had been a butcher's. It represented not rage, but reason. It was the perfection of efficiency: one bomb, one plane, one city. For 6 years, humanity had waged war in the clouds. It had filled the air with noise, flame, and courage. But this was different. There was no dogfight, no resistance, no warning. The atomic bomb rendered the very concept of heroism obsolete. It did not require bravery or skill. It required obedience. The push of a button, the opening of a hatch, and the entire world changed. When news reached Japan, the empire trembled. The Kamikaze had died in fire for their emperor, but now there was nothing left to die for. The divine wind had been replaced by a godless storm. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people in a voice heavy with shame and disbelief. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. The war was over. Humanity had won and lost. In the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, doctors walked among the dead in silence. Birds fell from the sky. Rain began to fall, black and warm, carrying the dust of the dead. Survivors, the hibakusha, wandered for weeks in search of water, shelter, and meaning. Their eyes had seen what no one had ever seen before: the fusion of science and apocalypse. The world below stared upward with new fear. The sky, that ancient symbol of freedom, wonder, and hope, had become a weapon of judgment. The age of the Stuka, the Me-262, the Kamikaze, the Flying Fortress, all were relics now. The future belonged to something colder, quieter, and far more final. In the laboratories of America, the Soviet Union, and Britain, scientists studied the aftermath. They saw not horror, but potential. Within months, the arms race began. The bomb had not ended war, it had redefined it. The sky would never again be empty. And yet, even amid that darkness, a strange truth remained. The miracle of flight, once mankind's proudest dream, had survived its own corruption. The same engines that burned cities would one day take humans to the stars. The same pilots who once aimed bombs would become astronauts. The sky, blood-stained and beautiful, would forgive, though it would never forget. In the decades that followed, Hiroshima rebuilt. Children laughed in parks that had once been graveyards. Nagasaki's churches stood again, their bells ringing in peace. But when the wind blew softly, the old could still hear the whisper, a hum like distant engines, a reminder that the heavens remember everything. The Second World War began with wings of hope and ended with wings of fire. From the Stuka's scream to the jet's roar, from the Kamikaze's sacrifice to the mushroom cloud's silence, the journey of flight had come full circle from wonder to horror, from invention to annihilation. And as the smoke cleared, humanity looked upward once more, not to conquer the sky, but to survive it. The age of heroes was over. The age of fear had begun. The war ended, but the sky has never forgotten.